Back in 2018, enterprise blockchains failed because it tried to avoid crypto. Today, I might make the argument that it is working because enterprise blockchains are actually embracing crypto. And that's really where we are today.
Quick shout out to today's sponsor, Katana. We'll hear more about Katana's 1 billion cat campaign later today. But for now, let's get into the episode. Hey everyone, quick disclaimer before we get into today's episode. Nothing said on Bell Curve is a recommendation to buy or sell securities or tokens. This podcast is for informational purposes only, and the views expressed by anyone on the show are solely our opinions, not financial advice. Our guests and I may hold positions in the companies, funds, or projects discussed. Hey, there he is.
Beanie Mike.
You know why I'm wearing this? Because I haven't gotten a haircut in a while, and hair's looking it's looking long here. Let me see. What do you think?
It's luscious, dude. Luscious. I have also been going like not on purpose, like 8 weeks between haircuts, and it just gets nasty. I think it's mainly because I had to switch to another haircut lady, and then I only realized this after about beyond the point where I can't switch, like we're at hugging level, that she charges $125 a haircut. The last person I had was like 55, and I was like, yeah, I mean that's steep, but like I'll do it. And then I was like, do you have any other other person's gone? Do you have any other people that do like men's haircuts? I'm like, yeah, Barbara. Oh, this lady's great. What
Myles.
the fuck?
Myles, do you remember the haircut that you took me and Andy to when we were in college in Atlanta?
Yes.
It's like, oh, there's this lady coming in really good. And then it was an $80 haircut when we were in college. And then Andy went up to the front and saw the price and was like, no, I'm not doing that.
He just didn't get a haircut.
I think it took me like 2 weeks to forgive you for that haircut saga.
I remember it was like off the side of the road in like some industrial park area. Well, I mean, that's like a lot of Atlanta.
It was right by Leon's Full Service because you guys paid after, and I was like, well, that was my budget for 2 weeks. So
fuck you, dude. This place is great. I don't know what it is with me and overpriced haircuts. What's up, Dave?
Hey, Dave.
Hey, guys.
We are just talking about overpriced haircuts.
Theme of this week's episode.
My last haircut was absolutely terrible.
Oh,
you had the Jesus locks flowing for a little bit of time at one point.
Yeah, like that time you didn't remember me.
Yeah, because you look different. I met you as Jesus Megan, and then like who is this? Nice,
clean cut guy,
Wall Street guy, clean cut.
I started raising the fund, and then I went as corporate as possible, and
that's hilarious. That is so funny.
You could have done locks of love with those puppies. That was a.
To be fair, I always get tempted to bring him back. Like even now, like it starts getting a bit longer, and I'm like, yeah, maybe one day. Don't mind it.
Mine is, I was just telling Myles. I mean, weirdly in Bozeman, it's like a 2-month lead time for haircuts.
What?
Yeah, it's crazy. There's weird stuff here where the infrastructure, there's been such an influx of population that the local supply has not caught up to the demand. So yeah, it's
that's crazy.
I called a couple weeks ago. It's like, hey, can I get a haircut? And they were like, yeah, we can book you in on January 19th. It's like, it's Thanksgiving. What are you talking about?
Just like a surgery or a haircut.
That's crazy.
All right, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Bell Curve. You got me, Myles, Xavier. Fellas, welcome.
Great to be back.
Good to be back. That was a good inaugural roundup last week, and I think we ended up talking about the subject of our show this week before we even formally introduced it, which is obviously we talked about ecosystem, like comparing platforms in Web 2 versus their Web 3 kind of smart contract platform counterparts, and we talked a lot about go-to-market and positioning, and we ended that conversations talking about the rebirth of corporate chains, because that's a super interesting intersection around positioning. It's something that's been around for a long time. This dates back to 2018 when we had our whole blockchain, not Bitcoin craze, and maybe we can talk a little bit about that. But we wanted to talk about corporate chains this week because it's a big wave that's happening again within crypto in our ecosystem, and we're going to break this talk down into 3 parts. So one, we're going to do a little bit of a history, which Xavier, you're going to lead in terms of, why did this topic, why were corporate chains originally a thing, and how have they changed over the years? When we talked about blockchain, not Bitcoin, back in 2018, that's actually very different from, so IBM's Strawberries on the Blockchain and JP Morgan's Onyx looks a lot different than Tempo looks today. And then we're going to get into what are the different design choices that exist there. So getting very specific about the changes that have been introduced in the intervening 7 years from when we first introduced this concept. And then we're also going to talk about strategy. And I think this is something that's been missing from crypto in general. When you talk about a value chain, so just because corporates can, like Robinhood could try to own the entire stack, doesn't necessarily mean they will. And how generally do you think businesses think about where they should dabble in the value chain and how it might apply to corporate chains and blockchains generally? But maybe, Zay, if I can hand it over to you here, rewind the clock back for us. Take us back to 2018. You had your Jesus locks. What did the origin of enterprise blockchain and blockchain not Bitcoin, what did that look like back then?
Yeah, happy to kick things off, and thanks for that intro, Mike. Funnily enough, this subject hits home for me. I actually started my career in blockchain working at a bank. So I was working at ING. This is back in 2020. And I was actually part of many of these initiatives that banks had during that time. I think we mentioned sort of around 2017, 2018, this concept of an enterprise blockchain popped up. And so today, I'm sort of here to explain what actually is an enterprise blockchain, what were they in the past, and give everyone a sense of sort of the history of this. Ultimately, many of these initiatives failed, and actually a lot of these initiatives I'm going to mention in a minute, I actually worked on a lot of these whilst I was at the bank. And so I know deeply about sort of what worked there, what didn't work there, how it's sort of changed today versus what it was back then. But to kick things off, I think it's just good to define, I guess, what actually is an enterprise blockchain. So yeah, taking us back to sort of circa 2018, enterprise blockchains were described as private, permissioned, and shared digital ledgers, but they were mainly sort of used to track data and for the properties that blockchains have, like transparency, security, efficient multi-party processes, etc. However, a lot of their use cases were not focused on money like we have in blockchains today, but more focusing on supply chain, financial settlement, etc. And so a lot of the big sort of enterprise chains back in the day, which were private and permissioned, some of these names people were familiar with today are Hyperledger, Auth Recorder, Ethereum Quorum, and a few others as well. So ultimately what these things really were back in 2018 and what the banks were using back then, they were sort of anti-crypto but pro-blockchain. So what that actually means is that they're sort of running these ledgers, which are more like shared databases, but they're trusted. They're not trust minimized, which is what public blockchains are today. And so there was always a question of is it actually worth having a shared database which is trusted, and do you actually get any utility value prop from that? Because ultimately all it's doing is making processes a bit slower, and there's a lot of conflict of interest between competing parties trying to move forward the ledger, which is of course sort of why we have public blockchains today and why we need incentives and tokens to run those chains. And so ultimately these initiatives sort of failed, like I mentioned before. So if you think about a private permission blockchain, like what we used to have back in the day, there wasn't any token that these networks had. And so today you might think of ETH on Ethereum, for example. These kinds of tokens are used to pay for gas, to incentivize node operators to run the network, to actually settle and move the ledger forward. So with these private permission blockchains that enterprises were using in 2018, there was no token. And so there wasn't much point in actually running or maintaining the ledger. And so a lot of these things failed purely because of that. Another reason they failed is because of governance. And so a lot of these chains, private permission chains, enterprise chains, etc., they had quite bad governance because they had to coordinate between competitors. And again, here, conflicts of interest made it really hard for them to coordinate and actually move forward and settle in ways that they thought were beneficial for all parties. Another reason I mentioned before, they were too slow versus a centralized database. And also, they weren't openly accessible, meaning that they weren't neutral like something like Ethereum is today, and ultimately also had very little liquidity versus what a public chain could ultimately have, such as Ethereum.
Mm.
For example, some other projects that went live back then, which I actually worked on some of these as well. You had like TradeLens, tracking containers, IBM Food Trust, which is like a food provenance kind of ledger. You had WeTrade, which is for trade finance, and you had some other things like, JPM coin, etc. Ultimately, no one wanted to run the nodes. No one wanted to fund these private blockchains. No one really cared about maintaining it. No one really captured value from it. And also no one was really incentivized to join or expand the network. So really from the start, the growth was somewhat throttled, I would say, and bottlenecked by the fact that they were private, permissioned, and they weren't incentive aligned, which is what you get in these public chains, which you guys will explain shortly. So two things did work back then, if you look back at it. One is JPM coin, which actually transitioned to Connexus. What this really is sort of like an internal settlement thing that they're using at JP Morgan now. The main change there is that they've evolved with the times and they're now actually settling on public layer 2s, not just private permission layer 1 that they were using back in the day. The second thing which actually worked quite well from the 2018 sort of enterprise era is actually Paxos. So they got started by tokenizing a bunch of assets in 2018, etc. And they've worked very well with regulators to the point now where actually, of course, many of us know Paxos today and they're tokenizing a lot of different assets and they have a lot of product market fit. Those two teams are really the only teams that survived, and all the other names I mentioned so far have pretty much failed at this point. And so the question is today, like, what has actually changed? Okay, so 7-8 years later, we see these corp chains coming back, for example, like Stripe Tempo. So what is the reason? So the main things that have changed in 2018, when I was in the bank working on some of these initiatives versus like what we have today, is because we have now stable coins, a lot better blockchain infrastructure, and actual economic incentives that we can use. And a lot of these things exist because of clear regulation. And so, tokens now are really considered pretty acceptable as financial instruments. Enterprises have clear frameworks to follow post-Genius. And so everyone's much more interested to get involved with blockchain. But this time it's blockchain with crypto and not blockchain without crypto. And I want to really clearly make that distinction. Right now, we know what works in blockchain, stablecoins, settlement infra, and tokenization, and infrastructure, regulation, liquidity is here now. And so for these reasons, basically, now is the time enterprises are sort of piling in. You're seeing corporate stablecoins, you're seeing Visa settling on Solana, you're seeing money market funds, you're seeing Base launch an L2, and you're seeing deposits on chain for the first time. So this time is actually different. We're using public chains, we're using tokens, there are stablecoins, we have liquidity, there are apps with real users, and we have regulatory clarity. So ultimately, what I sort of want to get people to take away from everything I've said so far is that, back in 2018, enterprise blockchains failed because it tried to avoid crypto. Today, I might make the argument that it is working because enterprise blockchains are actually embracing crypto. And that's really where we are today. And that's where the sort of whole reasoning for this episode today is the fact that it does look so different to what it did look years and years ago. And so, yeah, I think it's a very interesting time right now to be exploring sort of some of the designs of these new enterprise chains and how different they were from back in the day.
Okay, there's a ton to respond to there, Xav. And one just item that I want to pull out and table for later is how JPM coin evolved and how it's now settling on public chains instead of something private and internal. I want to connect that to a point I'm going to continue to make about Tempo later. But before we get there too, I also want to address there was a huge optics challenge. I think many different things were getting rolled up into one, and you just did a really good summary of the last, frankly, 7 years around this topic. But there was a huge optics push back then, and the whole blockchain, not Bitcoin, was because Bitcoin was such a toxic word back then, and it was clearly most of the financial world thought that it was, rat poison squared or whatever the word was of the day. And Jamie Dimon said that he was going to fire anyone who traded Bitcoin, which is hilarious, which is just hilarious. So there was a genuine optics problem. I also agree that maybe just restating something that I heard you say as well is there was actually a real problem back then in that a lot of the technologies and primitives and things that we've built today, even on public ledgers, just straight up didn't exist back then. And so I think a lot of corporates didn't even have the tools to build something that would be useful at that point. And then lastly, I don't think that they were thinking like this, but there is a real element of public blockchains and what we're starting to see with Genius and how it's impacting banks that are disruptive. So maybe we can also go back now with hindsight 2020 and say, yeah, it's not surprising that banks they saw all of the downsides of crypto, but none of the upsides, because it's highly disruptive to their business model. And I'm going to pull in maybe we can end this episode with a recent post that Multicoin just put out about stablecoin enabled fintechs and how that collapses the moat that essentially regulated banks in the United States had. And so I guess also with the benefit of hindsight here, it's not actually really surprising that banks and companies didn't jump in. One, because the tools didn't exist, but especially for banks, it is really disruptive to their business model. So what's that old saying about you can't pay a man to understand something, can't get a man to understand something that his salary depends on? I'm butchering this quote, but some old journalist said that. So anyway, that's also my retrospective on that period of time as well. And but the reason I think it's so timely to do this is because if you've been around crypto for a number of years, you've watched, I think, a lot of cynicism, and a lot of adults come in the room and say, okay, kids, thanks very much, we'll take it from here, and then promptly got their asses handed to them for 7 years, and it hasn't worked. But that doesn't mean that it was never going to work. This episode is sponsored by Katana. Katana is a DeFi first chain built for deep liquidity and real yield by redirecting chain revenue back to active DeFi users. The 1 billion KAT campaign is live. Bridge and deposit directly into vaults in one simple click and start earning immediately on your Ether, Bitcoin, USDC, and more. Follow the link in today's show notes to get started. As always, investments in blockchain technology involve risk, terms, and conditions apply. Do your own research. Myles, I'd love to get your opinion on this around, we talked a little bit last week about this strong versus weak technologies argument that Chris Dixon introduced. So essentially, when a new technology comes around, there's a weak and a strong version of that. The weak version is, hey, something that conforms to solving the problems of today's world. You might think of it as the skeuomorphic version of the technology before the stronger, more disruptive version gets embraced. So I think a lot of people drew connections between private intranets and public intranets, between private blockchains and public blockchains. But I'm wondering, is that the right framework, that one is just better than another? Because you had a lot of debates. I actually took part in a debate in 2018 about, are private blockchains or public blockchains better? Or did we need to adopt our frameworks to find a way for companies to partake in this space? Is it one is better than the other, or different actors have different requirements, and some private and public elements are going to mesh into something that makes a lot more sense?
I'm totally with you. I think so if you just look at the arc of the type of activity that we're talking about, it, as Xavier went through, it definitely did start with being totally private and permissioned, almost, moving part of their back office onto this new, type of rail, right, that can run 24/7. And that was largely a failure because, first of all, the infrastructure was not that good at the time. And I think more importantly, just misaligned incentives and fragmentation, like consortium fragmentation, right? If you're not into the first consortium, then you're going to create a different consortium that, is not led by one of your competitors. And it just broke down. And then we entered a period, I think, of, these TradFi institutions deploying on public blockchains and public blockchains only. And that's when it was probably the peak of, in retrospect, this is obviously the strong, public blockchains are the strong side, and private is the weak side. But the retrospect today, I think, is worth it because a lot of the companies that, first deployed on public blockchains over the last 3 or 4 years are now moving more of their, basically launching their own chains, right? Yeah. And we're saying, okay, is this a return to private blockchains? Does this beg a retrospect on that question, or are these entirely different animals? Which I think they are, but it's just not quite as black and white these days. There is lots of shades of gray as to what you want to call things like tempo, or even some of the corporate deployed rollups, right? So. And extrapolating that forward as to what the end game is here, and is that actually a failure for public blockchains, if they're successful? So, I think we've entered a new period where this retrospect is worth it.
So, Myles, can we get into the second part of our discussion here? And can we introduce all of the shades of gray that have emerged since 2018, when we had this very clear definition of a blockchain, which was federated, not everyone could participate, you couldn't even access or read the data. And now all of these different shades of gray have emerged. Myles, you also strike me as a guy who loves a 2x2 matrix. So I think you've actually might have built one for us this episode. So here, I want to get this up.
I have to meet my 2x2 quota, at least one an episode. But yeah, I think this is basically a useful framework to think about it. There's two main spectrums here. There's public versus private in terms of who can actually read and verify state. So this is just data, right? Who can run a node, who can see data, pull data from a block explorer, and then you have another spectrum of permissionless, totally permissionless, and totally permissioned. And this one gets even has many shades of in variations within itself, because permissionless can mean a lot of things, or permissioned can mean a lot of things, right? Like Base is permissionless to deploy smart contracts on. Anybody can use it, right? But not anybody can run the sequencer. And so that's maybe one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum would be like an L1, where the validator set is gated, users are KYC gated, and contracts are governance gated, right? And it can be like any mix or match of these things. And so we now have like a much we went from basically in 2018 everything was in the bottom left corner or in the top right corner, right? And now we've got a really interesting like spectrum to consider. And these design decisions are basically of where you fall on this. If you're going to launch one of these things, I think is actually going to be very, very important in thinking about like where all this is going, and if they'll be successful, or if they'll be we'll kind of like rerun the failures of 2018. So I think in a broad sense, we have again, nothing's changed in the top left and top right corners. And the top left corner here, we're starting to see like Aztec, which can offer privacy in a permissionless setting, which is super interesting, and it's taken a long time to get there. But yeah, I think most of what we see today, when we're thinking about like the names that I think that really drove us to do this episode, are falling into the bottom right corner, right? So they are, they look like public chains in a lot of ways, right? Most of them have public state. But they pick and choose, areas where they think they want to exert more control, right? So if you want to ensure that there's no, OFAC sanctioned transaction or users and transactions going to those users on your chain, then you're probably going to want to have a gated validator set so that you can reject transactions, or a gated sequencer, right? So you can reject transactions that are non-compliant that could get like your company in trouble, right? Because the main point here is regulators have people that they can call in this quadrant for the most part. And in the top right, who are you actually going to sue? Like you can go after all of the validators of Ethereum, but so far, that hasn't really happened, and it's like World War III, resistant, right? And I would argue that there are shades in this bottom right corner that is less like a corp chain and a lot like a Cosmos chain. I worked on Osmosis and DYDX, worked very closely with them. And they weren't considered like a, permissioned blockchain or like any flavor of enterprise chain, but they did have governance gated contract deployment because they wanted to optimize for a certain use case, right? And they didn't want their block space crowded by all this non-core crap, because that degrades from the core product. So that, you could argue a few of these things are very, very much so like Cosmos inspired, especially in the sense of less around control, but more around capabilities, right? So it's like, hey, we want to basically implement the, best open source implementations of like every part of the stack, whether that's, native account abstraction, maybe that's some enshrined protocols like we saw with Tempo's docs yesterday. They have like an enshrined AMM, custom fee structures. And these are just things that, Cosmos kind of showed the world that you could do when you owned your own chain and your own execution environment. And so I think we're seeing a lot of that. And then I would say that like broadly, the third flavor are these like network of networks, consortiums where and I don't know if it's fair to call them a consortium, but it's more this idea that Canton, I would put in this category, as well as ZK Sync, as well as AVAX subnets to some extent. It's like, okay, you guys can have full control, equivalent to having a private blockchain, but that's okay because you're connected to this broader network that is in itself more decentralized, right? So like assets, use a decentralized interop, network to move around these networks, and you can allow for like different levels of opinionation of how much control each and how public or permissionless it is to use each of the individual ledgers within, say, like the Canton network or within ZK Sync's roll up network. I don't know what the correct term is for that. So that's how I would categorize like what we're seeing today for the most part. It's corporate L1s that are like shades of Cosmos, but also shades of enterprise, blockchains from the past. You have these corporate rollups where, I think it's borrowing finality, right, and censorship resistance to some extent from Ethereum. But in other senses, you could argue these are just even more centralized, than the Cosmos approach, because it is a single sequencer that controls everything, right, and decides who can, they can censor anything they want, right. And then you have these like networks of networks where you can have, even more control, in a, I guess, on a local level, but be connected to, all these other chains, right? So yeah, I'll pause there. Does that spectrum make sense to you guys, or does the Cosmos comparison, resonate at all, or are you seeing this differently?
It makes sense to me. It makes sense to me. And one of the reasons I like to see this visualized in this way is I always I push back generally across the morality spectrum that gets, I think, unfairly positioned on crypto. I mean, these things are ultimately technologies, and I mostly reject a lot of the commentary around this is good versus bad versus this is a product or service that the market wants or doesn't want. And generally, when you draw these 2x2 matrices, the top right is the place you want to be, right? Like just every investment pitch deck you've ever received, you want to be in the top right, and you want everyone else to be in different spectrums here. But I think that Aztec is a really great one, where Aztec probably has the most cypherpunk street cred you could possibly have, and it's not in the top right here. And it's actually private. But the reason it's private, which has historically been a bad word in crypto, is because you actually want some amount of privacy with transactions. And there's a general acceptance in Ethereum land as well that it might be a crucial design flaw of chains, the Ethereums and the Solanas of the world, that everything is default open. And I think that's prevented probably a lot of acceptance from the corporates of the world. And I also think too that sometimes it's difficult the devil is in the details often with these things. And sometimes if you are trying to get something like achieve a property that you want, like privacy, it can infringe on other areas around permission versus permissionless. So Canton versus maybe Aztec is a good example here, because Canton, if we were to describe the architecture in a sort of a naive way, it almost looks, I think, Myles, you said this last time, a little bit Avalanche-like, in the sense that they have these network of interconnected subnets, although Avalanche calls them L1s now, but the idea is basically the same, that you're going to want your own sort of customizable block space. Cantons is also private by nature, but the way that it all works is it relies heavily on a very trusted set of subnet operators and kind of this underlying infrastructure where data gets shared. And so in order to achieve the property that you want of privacy, you do have to sacrifice a good amount in terms of the permissionlessness. Maybe for a certain subset of actors, that's okay. Or maybe it's more challenging. I think there's probably an interesting history that we could do on banking consortiums around Visa. And actually, banks have occasionally banded together to produce really interesting products like I think S&P actually comes from a consortium of banks as well at some point. So who knows? Maybe it's good enough. But I think the devil's in the details here too with the different architectures.
Totally. And I think the more interesting question is, why is this? Why are we seeing this? Why are they deploying like their own chains? Why is this happening? And how much is it increasing, their potential value capture versus how much is it attributed to, I would say, like capability gaps that of public chains. Basically, I want these features and properties, and I can't get that on public chains. So, I'm going to go stand up my own chain that is customized, like perfect for my application, which could look like a Cosmos chain, or is like a Cosmos chain in spirit, I think, but also could end with the same like consortium fragmentation that we saw that led to the failures of 2018 last time. But yeah, things like privacy, things like fast finality, enshrining core, like some nationalized like services, right? These are just things that you cannot do on Ethereum or Solana. And you potentially could do it as a roll up, but it's interesting that we're not seeing roll ups as like the default choice. It's, if anything, I think we're seeing like more and more of these become like actual L1s. And so, yeah, I go back and forth between, is this just purely like a value capture play, or is this more of like a capability gap and like a reflection of the failures of public chains to be able to, accommodate everybody and everything?
Maybe just one thing to note, which I think we haven't necessarily touched on, but I think it's just as critically important. When you look at the top right, there's Solana and Ethereum. There's also maybe something else to be said around like centralized versus decentralized. So another interesting one I think to think about is actually Hyperliquid here on this quadrant. Hyperliquid is permissionless and public, but like somewhat centralized. I'm not saying it's completely centralized, but they have between 15 to 20 validated nodes. It's quite hard to get into the set. And you look at the things in the bottom right of this quadrant, you have Tempo versus Robinhood. To the best of my understanding, Robinhood will be pretty centralized because it'll be a layer 2, probably with one operator, and that's a way of capturing more value, as we all know. Then there's Tempo, which to the best of my knowledge is going to be decentralized. They have a lot more design partners there. And so it's public and it's permission, but it's also quite decentralized. So this is like another thing I think is quite interesting in terms of like, even though they're already quite separate with public, permissionless, permission, private, etc., there's another thing to be said around the centralization versus decentralization. And I do think a trend in crypto right now is that like decentralization is mattering less and the market is somewhat rewarding this. And so I think people don't mind for chains to be permissioned these days as well, because there's already a trend that's pushing towards centralization. There's now pretty much a trend that we're seeing that's also pushing more towards permission. You're seeing Solana and Ethereum on the top right, but right now, all those ones on the bottom right, they're all newly sort of like announced chains, let's say. And most of the successful sort of chains is obviously still very, very early. But the big brands that are coming in now, I expect the trend to continue, that a lot of these will continue being public, permissionless, and also somewhat centralized. So yeah, it's interesting, I think, to note like the different validator sets as well in some of these ledgers.
Shout out to today's sponsor, Katana. Katana is a DeFi first chain built for deep liquidity and high yield. No empty emissions, just real yield and sequencer fees routed back to DeFi users. Incubated by Polygon Labs and GSR, Katana is launching with notable ecosystem of primitives, assets, and partners like Morpho, Chainlink, and more. Katana's 1 billion KAT campaign is live. Bridge and deposit directly into Vault in one simple click and start earning immediately on your Ether, Bitcoin, USDC, and more. Follow the link in today's show notes to get started. As always, investments in blockchain technology involve risk, terms, and conditions apply. Do your own research. On that point though, Xavier, can I push back a little bit? Because I've said that as well, that blockchains are moving in one direction towards being more permissioned and private and centralized and all that stuff. But is that how value has actually accrued, if you were to look at it? Because there is an obvious arrow of direction here where, we started with Bitcoin as the most decentralized, least performant, but most robust and, ossified from a governance standpoint and all that stuff. And no one's trying to compete on that vector anymore. Everyone's going more towards centralization, more towards performance, more all of that stuff. But if we were to look at the market caps and where value has been created, I would still say, some 70% of the total crypto market is made up of Bitcoin and Ethereum, which are the ones which are most decentralized on this spectrum. So while I would agree that there's a clear direction of travel in terms of the evolution and what people are trying, I'm not actually as clear that it's led to positive results yet. I think actually at this point, that's still a very open question as to where value is going to be created. And I do wonder, we have swung very far in the spectrum of trade-offs in between permissionless and public and private. But I wonder where the market will ultimately end up rewarding these different trade-offs. And I think that that's an open question. What would you, I don't know if you have a response.
I think it's a great point. If you look at Hyperliquid, what's happened there, and just the success that Hyperliquid's seen, one would argue probably has had the most success in crypto in the last 12 months. That is really, I think, kind of following the trend. Solana itself was incredibly successful and more centralized than Ethereum, and still is growing quite fast. I think both will exist. Like, decentralized chains will continue existing. I totally agree with you. This goes back to what we were talking about in the last episode, but I have been thinking about it a bit more the last few days. I do think there is some kind of monetary premium for being public, permissionless, and decentralized. Like, I think we don't know exactly how big this premium is, and maybe this premium is compressing in real time right now. When Tempo launches as a public permission chain, which is probably a lot more centralized, I don't think it's going to have this monetary premium. I think people are going to be valuing this like a real business and, like a payments business, like pretty much like how Stripe is valued today. And for that reason, I think like it's an interesting thing to think about when these chains start launching. Like, will they be like the multiples be more like Ethereum and Solana, or the multiples more be like an equity, like the equity businesses? I would make the argument they're going to be like the equity businesses. And I think that Ethereum and Bitcoin, like you mentioned, Mike, I think they'll continue having this monetary premium, the assets used as collateral, which is within the economy, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think, yes, you can also value them based on the fees and the revenue, the business model of those networks itself. But Bitcoin doesn't really have this, at least right now. And that really is just being valued as money. I do think right now Ethereum is being valued as both. And then I also think that Tempo and Robinhood, et cetera, will not have any of that premium like whatsoever. In saying that, another thing I've been thinking about before I hand the mic back to you guys, if you think about like Ethereum as well as like an asset and like how decentralized it is, it kind of has to be, because this is like a blockchain that the world needs to use as like almost like a hedge. It's like this thing will never like go down. It has all the finance you need. I don't think we're quite there yet in terms of like what it should actually be, but it is permissionless. We can access it if we need it, blah, blah. It's like everything exists basically. We need to trust the fact that this exists. On the flip side, you look at Stripe, the volume they're doing right now, et cetera, et cetera. Ethereum is like looking at real world assets, AI, like kind of a lot of different categories, trying to find exactly what it is. And I think we still don't even really know 100% what Ethereum is going to be. Like maybe it's the blockchain for agents, or like who knows. But like I think Ethereum's ambition is quite great versus like a Stripe Tempo. A Stripe Tempo is really bringing a lot of their volume they already have on chain, and then you can pretty much value it straight after that. And so why I'm saying all this is because I do think that the centralization trend, at least for me, will continue with corp chains and big brands and stuff like that. But I think that as a result, they're going to be very verticalized and specific, and a bit like the app chain thesis we're talking about in the last episode as well. And that one I know that Myles is very fond of. I'd love to hear your take on this as well, Myles. But I can see corp chains going quite centralized and not having any monetary premium whatsoever. And then on the flip side, I do think that as these corp chains go live, it'll be even more important to make sure that these actual public permissionless blockchains continue being relevant and mattering. Because if they lose the monetary premium and they don't find PMF in some segment, and then a vertical corp chain takes that, then I think their monetary premium goes to zero, and potentially Stripe and stuff like that will be valued more. Like, it might be crazy to think about right now, but I do think that this is all at risk. That's just like some high level thoughts.
Yeah. And I definitely have some responses. Like the 2018 enterprise chains failed because competitors will not like build on your competitor owned rails, right? And the reason that Ethereum and Solana have the market caps that they do today is because they enable 24/7 any asset, like any type of asset settlement, and it's owned by nobody, and it can it's hosting fierce competitors on the same rails, right? That's what we see. That's why the market sees this potential to be like the rails for any sort of asset, and all of finance moving on to one or more of them, right? And I think there's a question of like, okay, I don't think that failure mode from 2018 has changed from, as if you're thinking about the likes of Tempo and Robinhood. Fidelity is not going to deploy RWAs on Robinhood's chain. Tempo has an extremely impressive list of design partners, but not a single one of them are Stripe competitors, right? And so what we're talking about is like a sector specific, platform, right? That is without a doubt, if successful, not going to be the only one in that sector, because Audion is not going to just say like, okay, yep, we're on Tempo now. Especially if it's controlled by if there is a token and there is value capture and there is control that is obviously going to be sitting with like the deployers of that. So that's kind of where I see like the failure mode not necessarily changing, but I do think like if Tempo were to try to become like Visa, right, where there is no native token that they own like, a massive amount of, there is some sort of distributed governance model that like channels value back to the participants that drive demand. Okay, now that could be a different animal. That's interesting. But yeah, I'll turn it over to you, Mike.
Yeah, I want to spend some time here talking about the bottom right quadrant of what we're looking at, which is Tempo and ARK and Robinhood. And I want to address this fear that at least I feel in the room of, oh my God, what if the corporates win it all? And here's the logic, right? Which generally people talk about. There are, by best estimates, something like 40 million monthly average users of crypto. Robinhood has, actually Robinhood I think only has about 20, but whatever. Pick your application, right? If this were to move on chain, we could dwarf by a full order of magnitude number of users in crypto at any given time. And so the fear and the logic is, what if one of these applications with a ton of users comes in and just wins it all, right? They just win, they just vertically integrate the whole chain. So the reason I'm just going to skip ahead to my conclusion, I don't think that that's going to happen, is just because you can do everything or you have the opportunity doesn't mean that you do. And if you look at virtually any mature value chain in the world, it's not entirely vertically integrated. And this is where I want to pull back out that example, Xavier, that I thought was super interesting that you started this with, was JP Morgan came in and their assumption was, we're going to create our own settlement network with JPM Coin. And since it has evolved to leveraging public blockchains. So I think that's a super interesting tell and data point. And I want to unpack through at least my conception of business logic and how this typically works, why I do not think that this is going to be the case. So, okay, first, I want to just start with, what is, like, I think a good way of framing this is, I'm going to address this, by the way, entirely from the perspective of a corporate that's looking to build on a blockchain. And I think a good heuristic first to ask yourself is there a product? Does the product use the rails, or are the rails the product? I think that's a really good question to ask yourself to start with. And, if we were to break down the different layers of the value chain, I'm going to go way more in depth later. I think there's kind of three layers, which is one, there's the base layer. Historically, we say this provides security. I'm going to say that this provides counterparty risk or a lack of counterparty risk. I think that's essentially what you're getting when you build on the core base layer of settlement. You're like, do I have strong assurances that if I submit a transaction, it will not be reversed, right? That's basically what it is, either for political prejudice or business strategy or sheer incompetence, right? Or technical, infeasibility, whatever that is. That's what the base layer I think you're mostly getting. Then in order to deliver that, there has been a whole network of, we call this like infra, but this is everything from, it's scaling. It's helping scale that core property of not taking counterparty risk up to a much greater, a much greater market. And actually, Myles, you and I have talked 2 years ago now about RAS and L2 frameworks and shared sequencing collapsing onto one. This is a topic for another day. I would say every infra category is going to collapse onto one, right? It's just going to be a bunch of shared services, everything from running a sequencer, outsourcing MEV, like block production. It's essentially Red Hat. A bunch of things that we call different names now, we're going to collapse onto this. Let's call it like scaling and middleware layer. And then there's the application layer on top of that, right? So those are your three layers. Now, most corporates are coming in from the application layer, right? And they're deciding, where do I want to play in this value chain, right? And okay, one pretty naive approach, I think, which is frankly what a lot of these corporates are doing, is I'm going to own the whole stack. I'm going to come in here. I've got all the leverage. I'm going to own the whole stack. I'm going to outline why I don't think that actually makes sense. And here's kind of like a checklist of what I think is a good way that most companies look at this. So there's 4 different criteria here. One is strategic importance. So core versus non-core. So basically, if something in my value chain were to fail and my whole business depends on it, it's core to where I want to focus and innovate on, then I'm going to vertically integrate that. If it's not core and I don't really care about it, even if there's profit there, maybe I don't want to focus on it. So a good example for Apple would be, the operating system, silicon hardware, those are core, but they outsource logistics, modems, that type of stuff. For auto OEMs, what they really care about is more towards the end of the value chain. They care about brand, marketing, dealer networks, distribution. Increasingly, they're moving into software and cloud interconnectivity, but those are the areas that they want. Virtually everything else that goes into a car, the steel, like they basically buy, I'm over exaggerating here, 7 fully manufactured parts and then just finally assemble all of that together. So almost everything that goes into your car today, car manufacturers actually say aren't core and they outsource it, which is pretty wild. Okay, so is it core versus not core? Differentiation versus commodity. This is just, where do we want to play in the value chain here, right? If there's an area which is highly commoditized and there aren't very many profits, maybe I don't want to play in that area. So chips for an iPhone is very differentiated, but for cloud data centers, where there's vicious competition and economies of scale, that's a pretty commoditized layer, and maybe it doesn't make sense for a lot of folks to play there. There's coordination and risk. So again, especially some of these fixed cost heavy value chains, where there might be high fixed cost but variable demand, you might just not want to take the risk, right? So you, via contracts and SLAs, you push that into a different part of the value chain and you isolate the financial risk away from you. Hotels do this too with licensing, brand licensing. So most hotels actually have individual operators, or if you're a large restaurant chain, you actually don't own, you don't own all of the individual franchise. You have franchise owners, and that's a way of, essentially owning the brand versus warehousing some of the financial risk away, cordoning it off from the core mothership and operation. And then finally, regulation and liability, which, before I even start to unpack this one, you can definitely see where that starts to apply within crypto. So I think these are kind of the 4 levers. These are kind of the 4 levers that we're going to look at here. And also, I'm just going to say right off the bat that it's, I think, an oxymoron to say, one, that settlement and DA are commoditized, but then also assume that a corporate is going to choose to compete there, right? You can start to see the logic violations of what a lot of people, I think, in this space are saying. I want to make this analogy live just a little bit more, and then I promise I'll stop my monologue here. I actually broke this down in terms of, I think sometimes it's easier to imagine like a very well understood value chain, like an automotive value chain, and then I wanted to compare that to crypto and see what you guys think. Okay, so this is a BMW. Xavier, you're a resident European, so I want everyone in their mind's eye to picture Xavier cruising around corners in this little BMW, right? And we're going to unpack what the parts are and how they got made. But these are, you have to excuse it, this is from ChatGPT. So these are, but basically 8 different parts of the BMW value chain. So there's actual raw materials and commodities. So all the iron ore and coking coal and steel and stuff that gets put in. Then all of that moves into different tiers of subcomponents and major systems. So that could be like a wheel or something like that, all the way up to a full car door. But the reason a full car door is like, there's no real, difficult electronics or anything that goes into that. So OEMs will almost entirely outsource that. Powertrain and high value systems. So anything that's around the engine, increasingly EV motors and electronics. Battery is super interesting. And this is a part where, even though it's deep down in the value chain, especially Tesla was entirely vertically integrated on their battery supply chain for a really long time, although that's starting to change. So this part, a lot of OEMs think of as core. Vehicle, platform, and body. So again, the entire exterior of the platform, that's all outsourced, although the design isn't. Final assembly and QA, that is owned by the OEM. Software design and digital systems. Historically, they used to outsource that. They're moving it in. Sales, distribution, and brand, that's like the relationships with the dealers, the brand of the car, the marketing, the direct connection to the customer, all core things that the OEM has decided to own. And then aftermarket and life cycle. This one is aftermarket parts are like, do you sell an individual replacement part to a repair shop? Really high margins on that, and it's kind of split. But the reason I'm talking about BMWs on a crypto podcast is because at maturity, the value chain is highly, highly specialized. And I just want to contrast that with some of the opinions that you hear in the industry today, which say, oh, well, BMW has all the leverage. They're going to own the entire value chain. No, they're not going to own the entire value chain. They're going to run it through this matrix-based decision around where does it ultimately make sense to play. By the way, this is, I'm not even good at this. ChatGPT is great, but man, the visualization has not caught up with the language processing. So, but you can basically see, this is roughly how they've decided. This is a 2x2 matrix. Myles, I also love a 2x2 matrix of supplier maturity. So there are a bunch of suppliers in the market that I could outsource to, and strategic importance. So I wanted to run this same exercise, and this is where I promise I'll stop monologuing here. But for blockchains, and if you were to break down all the different things that have to happen in a blockchain, consensus and security, data availability, the actual execution environment. So not where the transactions or the data gets posted, but where they actually take place. Bridging and settlement, the networking layer. So this is anything related to, frankly, a lot of like MEV related stuff. Development infrastructure, so RPC providers, indexers, honestly, a lot of data visualization stuff here, wallet and identity, governance and economics, and then finally ecosystem and BD. I want to open it up back to you guys here. And I'm very curious, through this lens of, okay, I'm a corporate and I'm moving into this space. Let's just say that they're not going to say, I want to own this entire space, although we can debate that. Where do you think it makes sense for them to focus? Like if you were the head of Robinhood Crypto, or you were running, you're Matt Huang and you're running Tempo, where are you focusing here?
Okay, I think before getting to Tempo specifically, like maybe take a look at if there's like an assumption that every like big TradFi or enterprise that has tons of leverage and is a leader in the market is going to vertically integrate everything. Like that's not the status quo today. I think, Mike, as you point out really well, right? And then, I worked at Fidelity for a very long time. Like we certainly did not. The brokerage was in-house. Asset management of those assets was in-house. The exchanges that, we traded on behalf of customers, obviously not in-house, right? Those are neutral venues. And that's why they could become, the most liquid and efficient in the world. Custody, we did in-house. Clearing and settlement, again, that's the DTCC and other like neutral venues, right? With crypto, it seems like when you deploy a chain, you are going a much like further, I think, in terms of vertical integration versus what we see like in the status quo from prior to like anything on chain existing. Like you are, I think, really touching pretty sensitive like functions of the value chain, like settlement, right? And you could argue if it's a chain, like the chain custodies the assets. That is the control that every like massive industry today has basically said no, like no single entity is going to own that. Like the entire market will be far more efficient if that is a shared sort of neutral service that we all use, right? And I think that's why like that mentally, like we map that so cleanly over to public permissionless blockchains as like being the one thing that the enterprises aren't going to touch. And so that's, where I think like the risk is for these enterprises that are doing this and like the potential ceiling. But yeah, Xavier, what do you think?
Yeah, I think you guys make some great points. If I have to sort of like break it down in terms of like why I think maybe the sort of BMW example is slightly different to the sort of blockchain example, I think it's just because now with blockchain infrastructure, like so much has been developed. And it is quite mature now, and it's somewhat commoditized. But what I'm saying is the difficulty to spin up a chain is actually not that hard. So if you have an application, let's say Stripe has Stripe app on Ethereum. The app does really well. They're giving up economics for people who are using the app because they're paying in ETH, whatever it is. So they're thinking to themselves, well, I want more of that value. So maybe I'd build like an app chain. I'd build a layer 2. Okay, the layer 2 is going really well, but it's settling to Ethereum. I'm still giving up value there. Well, I want to control the economics. I want to control all of it. Like it's my app. Like give me all of it. I'm greedy. I think like the reason why they can do this right now is because it's never been easier to like build your own chain and control the economics. The hard part right now, as we're all very aware, is actually like distribution of those chains. And you've seen most generic public permissionless chains fail this year simply because they just do not have the distribution that Ethereum or Solana has. And it's incredibly hard to build that distribution. Base here is a good example of like building a chain layer 2 with existing distribution, and they're doing very, very well. So I kind of wonder with Stripe that like, if they can hook into merchants and they don't even realize they're using crypto, like this is going to get very interesting very, very fast, in my opinion. And so the reason why I can see why they're choosing to do it all themselves is because I feel like it's a lot harder to get distribution and get to those people and have them using crypto as opposed to like building the chain itself. And if they've solved that problem, I feel like the blockchain infrastructure side can be somewhat more easily solved, at least for Stripe. I also want to like actually give this one back to you guys and hear what you guys think about this. So, you know, Stripe Tempo announced a lot of their testnet sort of data in the last day or two. So I saw a tweet from Hasib today, I think, mentioning that, you know, they're still charging merchants 1.5% or something like that. I'm pretty sure today is like 4 or 5% in fintech land, and then on chain it'll be like 1.5%. They do have distribution, so there's a question of like if merchants actually care, because they're still saving a lot of costs compared to like what they have today. At the same time, I think, Mike, where I do really actually agree with you, the fact that they are building a chain, it might actually be like sort of slowing them down in terms of finding PMF for certain apps on their chain, because they're just launching a sort of generic chain and they want to bring apps to this chain. And the question is, do they have any apps that people actually want to use? And is the UX actually better than what these people have today, for example? And so if you build the chain first before you actually start building the apps, which is what they're doing in this case, you have a lot less wiggle room when it comes to trying to find unique things that actually people really value and want to use and keep you in front of your competitors. So the way that I've been thinking about this kind of lane in terms of app versus app chain versus chain itself, which I think is interesting, and I'll tell you your guys' opinion, is at least if you build an app, for example, let's say you're targeting merchants with an app and it's like 0.2% or something like that instead of 1.5%, and you're using ZK or something like that, or some like very unique and defensible distribution strategy to get in front of a bunch of merchants. It's like so obvious that then they're going to save all this money. It's incredibly hard to do. But my question now is like, if that happens and if someone does come up with 0.2% instead of 1.5% and they do get the distribution, how much does that actually impact like Tempo itself as like a chain? Because like they focus a lot on the infrastructure and the chain itself, when actually maybe there's just one killer use case in the application that like all merchants wanted to use anyway and save a bunch of fees for a much better experience. So like the question with a chain like Stripe, which I like the fact that it's targeting payments. The question is like, can you build an app and actually move faster building the app? And maybe it's on Ethereum or some layer 2, whatever it is, and get in front of like the chain. Because realistically, even though it's not hard to build a chain, it still takes time. It takes a lot more time to set up a chain and like do all this. And like Mike here, I think your image is really great around actually everything you need to do, which you need to think very hard about in terms of like to put all that together. And also, I guess right now, when you look at these sort of 8 things on screen, there's not really many services. There are some that exist that put these all together, but like, I don't think Stripe could go to any person or entity today and be like, hey, these are the 8 things. Like, what are you specialized in? We'll take that from you. We'll take that from you. Like, I don't know, Mike, if you like think differently here, but.
So, okay, can I respond to some parts of that? And so I actually would say that Stripe is doing that. Look at the acquisitions that they've made. So one area that I was going to point out is the wallet layer. To me, if I'm an application, that feels ripe for, that feels core. Identity in the wallet layer, if I'm an application, like I do not want to, like think about how many application developers over the years have complained about MetaMask, right? That's just, first of all, there's a core UX part there. Like that is core to the business, right? That is core to what your application is. So, and then look at what Stripe has done with Privy. They've also acquired Bridge, right? To me, those are really strategic acquisitions, which are going to improve the core parts of the value chain that they can innovate on, which I agree. I mean, it's ecosystem and BD, right? These are the parts, ecosystem and BD. And I would actually say wallet and identity are probably the 2 most important areas if I were Stripe. And the reason why they could potentially win at consensus and security and DA, I'm actually going to make the case that 1, it doesn't make business sense. And then 2, I'm actually going to even contend that they could do it even though they're going to try. So 1, imagine you have $100 and you have to disperse that, in each of these different categories, right? And you get a certain payout. There's a certain ROI dependent on, hey, if I invest $1 into BD, that's super valuable. No one else can do that. I think there's a ton of upside in value. I might get $5 back. And And then let's go down to the other layer, which is consensus and security and DA. We all know these are commodities, right? So I invest $1 there, maybe I only get $1.50 out. So from a pure business ROI case, yes, they could do that, but should they do that, right? Because they're not going to win on this monetary premium, anyway. So you might as well just, it's a dollar in, dollar out thing. So if we think that they can invest, if they can get the best ROI by focusing on BD, wallet, and security, again, kind of business sense and logic would dictate that that's where they want to play. Now, I do think that there's this, hey, I think that what's actually driving this is one, we talked about platforms in the past. Everyone wants to be a platform. People don't want to be a product. So I think there is a slightly outdated version of, hey, I want to be a platform and win the entire stack. And I think I have the leverage to do that. That's what I would guess is driving the business logic here. But I want to contend about how possible that really is, because I think what you need to be at the consensus and security and DA layer, you need the neutrality, right? I'm going to contend that it's even possible for them to do this, or that it's going to move the needle for them. Because one, in order for Stripe to extract the amount of economic value and transactions that you would get as a platform, you're violating the core principle of what makes a good consensus security DA layer, which is neutrality. So to me, they're oxymoronic. They don't actually go together. Or what you do is, yeah, we're not going to be extractive. Don't worry about it. And then you don't get anything for your investment. And by the way, we talked the whole last episode about how hard it is to do go-to-market, and how high the barriers to entry are and how difficult this is to replicate. So I'm looking at where like Ethereum, Celestia, Solana are playing, and I'm like, this is both a very commoditized area, but in an unbelievably difficult to replicate area. And then finally, when I think about the importance from Stripe's standpoint, right? I think we're building a whole bunch of new financial apps, and the core innovation of blockchain is innovating on counterparty risk. And will you rug me? Are you going to screw me? And blockchains afford you the ability to say, actually, you're not going to get rugged or screwed due to political or strategic reasons. And so as soon as these corporate chains get into that, like once you like really think about that, you're like, well, I don't actually, me as a consumer, I don't think Robinhood's going to screw me. If I'm Interactive Brokers, am I going to go on this? Do I think that Robinhood, the owner of this layer, would screw me? Yeah, I think they're good to screw me. So I think that's why, to me, look, the BMW analogy, you cannot map analogies perfectly one onto one another, right? That just doesn't work. But the reason I wanted to go through that in detail is, to outline some of the thinking. This is how I believe companies approach these sorts of problems and decisions around where to play. And I think the same amount of nuance will get translated into crypto value chains. And this is just my guess on what I think happens. So I actually love the L2 construction. I hate the L2 construction as we originally thought of it, which there are going to be a bunch of generic ecosystems that get built on top of Ethereum. Like, I don't think that's going to work at all. But what I do like is applications that there is like this intermediary scaling technology, which is pre-confirmations, white glove support and tooling. This is the Red Hat model. I like apps, Red Hat, ETH. That's what I like. That's what I think this ultimately ends up being.
I agree. I do think L2s are like actually much more complicated than L1s in a lot of senses, like to get all the guarantees that you actually want. And when you start peeling back like the things that make L2s like kind of decentralized, and they get, arguably like more and more scary in terms of how centralized they are and what they can do, then let's say like, an L1 with like at least a decent size gated validator set. And maybe back to your question, Xav, like how would you try to compete, right? How would you, if Stripe is still charging 1.5%, do you go and deploy on Tempo itself and use their free infrastructure and free middleware, right? And try to undercut them. And then, or do you, I think more likely like what startups will do, when they don't want to have to compete like on trust with Stripe, right? And one way to not compete on trust and actually use that like against them is to be on a public blockchain, right? Like a Solana or something like that. And then you can get, partnerships potentially even with Stripe's competitors that help you win distribution. But yeah, I just would call out like the 1.5% is obviously not like just for moving stable coins on Tempo. That's for all the periphery services, right, that Stripe offers today, just moving over to Tempo and having, the stable coin be like the settlement asset, but also facilitating like those, merchants to get paid in fiat, right? So they integrated like on and off ramps. And probably, one thing about blockchains is scary is like there is no reversibility of transactions. And I'm guessing Stripe is charging like most of that 1.5% is because they're taking like guarantees on fraud, right? And if something goes wrong, like they'll make you whole. So how do you not like try to compete where you have competitive disadvantages? Like then I think you go and look for public blockchains where eventually you can basically counterposition against them in that sense.
Yeah, 100% agree with you, Myles, and I think that's exactly right. I think the way to compete with these corp chains is exactly going to an Ethereum or a Solana or something like that, a neutral platform, building bottoms up, and then trying to get out in front and compete against these big corp chains. And you're totally right. The 1.5%, like, it's going to be really interesting because even right now they pay much more than that, and they still use Stripe. Stripe has all the power. They have the leverage, and so even it sort of feels like a better deal to the merchant. So the question is, like, again, like you said, like, how do you compete? Is it just a cost thing, or is it a convenience thing? For example, like in Stripe's case, it's surely a convenience thing. I think another point I actually wanted to mention, and this one's thrown at you, Mike. So what I also find very interesting about Tempo is that I don't know if they invested or acquired. You might be able to sort of confirm, but Commonwear, of course, shout out to Patrick, great guy, and regular on the show. So what he was building, super cool, brilliant. His initial idea was sort of like this red hat layer talking about, Mike, like kind of middleware, like RPC nodes. Like his initial pitch early on, which always made a lot of sense, was like you have the blockchain, which is kind of like free, then you have all these services you provide to the blockchain, and you kind of charge for that, and that's like sort of plug and play. So I do think like. And here as well, like I would sort of maybe make the argument that they haven't really outsourced it, they've insourced it almost. They've kind of like brought what he's doing into Tempo to like accrue that value like they've done with the other acquisitions as well. So yeah, I'm curious, Mike, like how do you see that? Like, do you think that makes sense? Like, do you see like other corp chains doing something similar? How do you see that?
I love the Commonwear model. I think Patrick got it exactly right. And yeah, I think this kind of services model on top of the free part around the commoditized stuff like settlement and DA is exactly the right. So maybe like a prediction of mine would be, I think the modular stuff was right, but the path dependence was a little bit off, and we vastly overestimated the amount of complexity and layers that we needed at the development that we are in the industry. So you had all of these different categories, right? And they looked different. Shared sequencing, roll-ups as a service, roll-up frameworks themselves, pick any number of different stuff. And I think ultimately all of that is going to collapse into one business model. So these things that started off on very different points are going to collapse into essentially service providers that sit on top of Ethereum or Solana or other public chains and help these applications get what they want, which is the free stuff from the public chain. And actually, an analogy that I would give you again is we actually basically had an overbuild of infrastructure in 2018, 2019. It was centralized infrastructure. It's like there was a gajillion custodians, and it was the same thing. Everyone wanted to build prime brokerage. It was some people started with lending, some people started with custody, some people started with cap intro, and then what happened was there was this explosion of funding because every VC could wrap their heads around it. And then it collapsed onto a couple of winners that aggregated all of those services into one. And now what do you have? You have Anchorage and Galaxy, and that's the end model. And I think if you look at L2s and L2 frameworks, shared sequencing, RAS, all of that stuff is going to collapse into essentially the Commonwear Patrick O'Grady model of providing services that help connect you to the public chain. Now, I thought like two points to end on here. I thought I just asked this question to ChatGPT, but I thought it actually got it pretty right, and I thought it was pretty interesting. ChatGPT sucks at imaging, so sorry. This should be strategic importance this way and supplier maturity this way. But in the top right, this is from the perspective of a corpo chain. Where does it tell you to focus? Ecosystem and BD. I think that's exactly right. But what you also have, I think is pretty interesting, is it views settlement and DA as being very important, like core, like strategically core, but there's also a mature supplier base. And so, yeah, I think that, this is ChatGPT and it's hallucinating. And frankly, it's like absorbed a lot of the crypto gobbledygook over the years. And I think there's some big flaws in how it thinks about it. But I thought it was interesting that it spit this out, because that's exactly how I view it too. I think that what public blockchains provide are both very core and strategic, but they kind of give it away for free. And I wonder if part of the reason why Tempo and Stripe are doing this is because they've been a fintech that have relied on banking partners for a long time and probably been deeply, deeply frustrated with the moat and the regulatory, kind of capture and incumbency that comes along with that interaction. And I dropped this to you guys in a chat here, but maybe to just demonstrate this, I thought there was a really interesting piece from Multicoin that just came out on basically stablecoins, vertically integrating stablecoins within neobanks. This is the challenge with like kind of the different eras of fintech. And the big challenge and why it's ultimately been commoditized is because even though you can innovate on this distribution layer, there is a fat regulatory incumbency and moat at the settlement layer. And even though these fintechs that are innovating on like UX for the first time in 20 years, right, from banking services and making things nice and trying to go in between countries, you can't solve some of these core things because you're still relying on a banking partner, and because you need a banking partner, and because the new number of FDIC insured commercial bank charters, like this is a crazy chart, right? Look at how much it dropped off post 2008. We go from 175 new banks to like 0 for a number of years, and then now it's back up to like 6. Because that has been so throttled, and because there's such an advantage to being a banking partner, they can extract an enormous amount of the value. So I do wonder if part of the thinking from Tempo here is to say, oh my God, we can finally get around these guys. And so this is kind of the, I know people love to use this term, but it's like commoditizing your competitor, right? And in this case, the competitor in the value stack for fintechs was banks. But yeah, it's a super interesting thing but I think while I understand the logic from the perspective of Stripe, I think it's probably good enough. You don't need to own it. I think it's good enough to just say, this is core, but it's also public and neutral, and it's never going to charge me a ton of money or extract a lot of value. So I'm just going to leave it. And I'm just going to leverage this and use it instead of own the entire thing. So that took us in a little bit of a different direction, but that's where I see this ultimately playing out as opposed to the current iteration.
Yep. No, I couldn't agree more. I think like if you own distribution, you are not going to want to compromise on UX, performance, and economics. And I think for the most part today, to get those things, you have to like launch your own chain or roll up. So we're going to see more and more of these. I think like what I'm excited about, from working on Delta is that you can get those things and still outsource, actually the security of the assets to, a neutral like settlement layer. Right. And I think we'll probably see we'll overshoot on how many of these, come out and how many of them are successful. And then we'll probably withdraw back, a lot of activity will come back to L1s, and L1s will probably need to be built to support these things. Right. Either that's some roll up strategy or I think, for Solana, they're trying to, enable application specific sequencing. Right. So how do you provide more control to these institutions that do have the leverage without, with making it less attractive to actually move to your own chain and settlement layer? Because I think control over settlement is really the crux of where this could fail. That's what your competitors do not want, to rely on you for. They don't today, even in old rails. So, that's kind of where my where I see the next 5 years going.
Yeah, I might actually mention one last point. I think a lot of this also just comes down to the human side. We talk a lot about technology. I think talent is everything in crypto. There's only that's really the finite resource, I think, in crypto is talent, not blockchains, not infrastructure, etc. And, one chain we didn't mention today, which just struck me, was Monad. And, of course, probably the most recent public permissionless blockchain to go live, also quite decentralized, by the way, in terms of that third thing that, these blockchain properties have. So I guess all this is to say that like the Monad team, very strong talent, like you speak with anyone at Monad, very professional, like tech is also great, but they're super supportive, ecosystem development, all great. Like Delta, Myles, I think also a strong team. If I think about Stripe, Tempo, some of the talent and also the resources they're throwing at this talent, it's a bit like AI right now, where like all this money is raised and it's just like paying these amazing AI engineers. And then of course you get great AI products. The thing with Stripe, which I think is interesting, or Tempo, I should say, is just the fact that they raised so much capital, like $500 million is bloody crazy. And so like they have to be throwing it somewhere, and they are throwing it at like, either buying things or probably paying like really talented engineers to build and ship and make sure that tech is great, and then, go from there. So I do think that talent means a lot, and potentially might even mean more than just being public or private, etc. And I'm definitely in the camp where it should always be public. I think we all are aligned there, but it'll be interesting to see like Tempo versus Monad, for example, because I think this is the most recent kind of public permissionless versus public permissioned. Who wins out there? Like I think that it was just like a TBD right now, and very different sort of target markets they're approaching, but also at the same time, two very exciting chains I think everyone is watching in the crypto world.
I agree, Xav, but money is an interesting thing. Money is not correlated to success in crypto at all. In fact, there's probably a pretty strong inverse correlation there. And my experience, even with, when we did that exercise of ROI and where to focus, even with organizations that have unlimited dollars from a financial perspective, no organization has unlimited focus. And I think the correct strategy and picking the right areas for any organization, literally, if you have unlimited money, you can get any talent you want. You still, like, honestly, I feel like I'm picking on Tempo a lot. I love Paradigm and Stripe, and this is great. It's kind of the most interesting corporate chain right now, which is why I'm maybe using it as a little bit of to try to dissect some of what I view as the core logic that underpins the decision. But, I look at a lot of the stuff that's coming out and these new innovations at the L1 layer, and, what you can do on Tempo that you can't do on Ethereum. And I'm kind of thinking, I don't think that matters. I think it's like mostly good enough at this point, even on Ethereum, which is famously like a really constrained L1 environment. And I think sometimes actually too much money can be a distraction, and it can allow you to say, I'm going to compete in all of these areas because I don't have to make decisions. Whereas this is a little bit of, I guess, maybe now old-fashioned thinking when it comes to startups, but I think the more money constrained you are, it forces you to decide where you want to focus and where you want to innovate on. And I think actually it's a little bit of a curse for big ecosystems that have infinite dollars and can just pay to solve every problem. I think you're more at risk of not having the right strategy.
Yeah, definitely some good points. What I do find interesting, and I totally agree, focus is really worth way more than money. With Tempo, if you think about what they're doing, they actually are like quite focused, if that makes sense. Like they are like targeting payments, like that. Like at least right now, I feel like they're not overstretching into like AI or something like that. Like maybe down the line they do that. But what I actually also find interesting, because it's a good point, Mike, like look at something like Ethereum, for example. Like, okay, I don't know exactly how much ETH they have, the foundation, etc., but I imagine it's still quite a bit. Like the hard part for generic chains, public permissionless generic chains, is like, where is the focus? Like, should they be focusing on something? Because maybe there's a competitor like Tempo that comes in like, I'm the payments chain. Then all of a sudden it's like, oh, maybe I want to be the payments chain, but I didn't really make up my mind in time, and now Stripe's taking it from me. So like maybe I do think there's a risk for the public permissionless chains like Solana and Ethereum, like because they are generic and they're trying to work out exactly what it is RWAs, is it AI, etc. Maybe the next corporate comes out in AI like Google. Like Google comes out saying, oh, thank you very much, Ethereum and Solana, for not choosing AI. I'm going to go build my own AI chain right now. And like, this is pretty sick. So I do think it's interesting, like where focus is. And I totally agree that this is everything for a startup. And I also agree with you, Mike, that like having too much money like can also be a bad thing for sure. And being resource constrained can also be a very, very good thing. But yeah, maybe there is a question, which could also be another potential podcast topic. It's like, what should these chains focus on? Like, should Ethereum be focused or not? Like, should Solana be more focused? And like, because maybe the risk is that they're not actually focused enough in terms of like exactly hitting something and finding an amazing amount of PMF in some category in particular. I don't know how you guys see that, but that might be something to think about.
All right, guys, this has been a really fun one. A lot of good debate on this one. A A lot of good 2x2s, Myles. Thank you for bringing.
Yeah, we'll keep them coming. We'll keep them coming once a week.
I think that should be a staple of the show. But guys, this was a ton of fun. Thanks for doing this, and yeah, well, I'll see you guys next week.
Sounds good.
Thanks, guys.
See you guys.